Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Hernan Diaz Alonso, the director here in SCI-Arc. I have to say, this has been a remarkable, busy, intense couple of weeks, midterms, but also last Friday we had the opening of Fabian Marcaccio's exhibition. Wednesday we have the lecture of Tom Wiscombe. Yesterday we have a big symposium on the world of homelessness with the Goethe Institute. And we get to close this intense 2 week with this informal conversation about the extraordinary work and legacy of Claude Parent, which right after this conversation, we will have an opening in our library. It's an extraordinary show. Let me tell you a little bit about the show, which is why we are here on the occasion of the beautiful book that Rizzoli has published recently, and I strongly suggest that you take a look if you don't want to buy it right now, but take a look, and it's an extraordinary book. But this came to us, and I have to say, it was not initiated by us, but it was initiated by Claude Parent, which, there she is, and Laszlo Parent. She came to us and said that she had this beautiful set of drawings that somehow managed not to be part of some of the prominent collection that the work is in. And we were interested to take a look and do something, and I think it took us like 30 seconds to say, yes, of course. I personally am a huge fan of Claude Parent. I consider him one of the seminal figures and a huge influence, I will say, in the culture of SCI-Arc of anybody who's interested in speculation and radical thinking. I had the pleasure to meet him in 2006. I was invited to do a small competition in Paris, and he was in the jury, and he voted for my project. So, but he gave a very good reason why, because he thought it was nasty. And what a great reason to like a project. But so Neil Denari, which I will introduce our panelists in a second, just mentioned to me that he was the last of the avant-garde gentlemen. I mean, after that, the avant-garde became something else, but he was part of that very weird species and a remarkable architect. And I have to say, there are many qualities why the work is so important to be shown and to be discussed. But one of the things is in a moment in which the principles of modernism was being challenged, he was an incredibly aggressive provocateur about that provocation, but very different than what it was known later as postmodernism. It was a different kind of rupture and provocation, one that it was rooted, I will say, in the ethics of modernism, but it was talking about something else. So before we jump into that, let me introduce our distinguished panel. We have with us Deborah Richmond, which local architect here in Los Angeles, practitioner, teacher, installation artist, writer, researcher. She works in multiple fields, like many of the people that we like. And she has been incredibly active in multiple exhibitions all over the world in America, but a very active voice in Los Angeles for at least since I've been in LA. So I know her for some time. Too long. And so we're very pleased to have you. Everybody has very long resumes, but in the interest to jump into the conversation and really trying to get to the bottom of it. Jennifer Dunlop Fletcher, who is also a longtime friend of SCI-Arc. Right now, she's the Helen Hilton Racer Curator of Architectural Design, as well as the head of the Department of Architectural Design since 2015 in San Francisco MoMA, which is, I have to say, out of the big museums in America, probably the one with the best pedigree of supporting radical and speculative architecture, exhibitions, and collection. She's part of a remarkable legacy of curators there, going back to Aaron Besky, Joe Rosa, among others. So it's fantastic that she is now the caretaker of that legacy and taking it to whole new trajectories. But she has been working in the world of architecture and art as a curator for many years as an incredibly important voice. So we're very pleased that she came, so she could enjoy also a little bit of nice weather, and like San Francisco. And last but not least is Neil Denari, which also is a big part of the SCI-Arc community. Neil was the director here in the school. Currently, he's in UCLA. We're not going to hold that against him. But he's a recurring presence in the school as a visiting professor in undergrad thesis and many other things. Again, his curriculum and his credentials are way too long, and everybody by now know him. So we're very happy that Neil is here with us, and also I know he is a huge fan of Claude Parent work. So, to go back to what I was mentioning about what a unique character and what a unique body of work Claude Parent produced over his very long career. So when we were talking about, I didn't have particular preset questions, but there were 3 or 4 topics that I thought it was interesting to talk. One, it had to do with the context of the book and the show, which is the idea of the power of the drawing as a speculation tool. And we know that today we are in different times in which this thing is mutating. So, but before we go to that one, the one I would like to talk about is what I was talking about, which is more about, in general terms, the legacy of a speculative work and the idea how his work has a reinvigorated force, and it's something that we come back to visit. So maybe to start in more general terms about what does it mean, his legacy for each of you in this context. Whoever want to go first.
I think you started down that road of saying that really he was such a strong force in kind of breaking the order of modernism while still respecting it. And I think that was a very important role. He studied with Corbusier, but then, you know, taking it away from the right angle and towards the oblique was such a strong and powerful move, and needed to happen in order to get to where we even are today.
But let's say somebody like you work in understanding building collections of architecture, and so let's say if we were to do like a trajectory of radical work, well, I would consider him one of the key figures of the 20th centuries. But I mean, of course, the oblique space and all that was a major departure, but also the way that he used the instrument of drawings and so on, also in terms of what it means in the flirtation with the artistic side of the things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious about your definition of radical. Like, what makes it radical? But yes,
let's use the word speculative, which I like it better. I never liked that much the word radical experimental, because I always think that those things mean like you don't know much what you're doing, which I think he was in total control of what he was doing. But anyway, I'm not the moderator, so I tend to deviate. So before we move on, let's stick to the legacy and the significance for each of you.
Yep.
Well, if you think about I think the two main, let's say 1960, take 1960, the two main projects are really French avant-garde project and metabolist work. You know, 1960 in America, there's John Johansson and a few others, but mostly it was the production of protecting modernism at its highest point, right? So the project for some practitioners, not artists, but practitioners, was about radicalizing what had probably already, for the most progressive architect, already seen modernism, become a different kind of political tool that on the one hand was maybe even tending toward, my mind, even though democratic ideas of good design were being spoken about, you could also see it as very, very conservative, at the same time. Although most practitioners, I would say in America, were imagining it was still a kind of an avant-garde, idea in a way. So the feeling I always had about the legacy of the work was not only about, the critical, critiquing modernism from within it, but that the idea of trying to overcome the limitations and overcome the kind of political limitations of it was, I I think he really led the way in France, because I could argue that his voice was the loudest because of the way in which he carried out the practice, as opposed to some of the other people in France who were a little bit more marginal at the time. But I don't know, in terms of, I look at strange avant-garde work from the same time period of French architects, but it didn't ever cohere in terms of a project, I think, because the way it did with Parent's work, because he was able to continue production, of work, including, I mean, we have to include theorizing the work with Paul Virilio, and getting toward the bunker archaeology later on and so forth that I think came out of all of that. So there's tributaries to the legacy as well that I think is important.
Debbie?
So in reading the book, this beautiful book that's just been published, I was really struck by some of the descriptions of him and how they contrasted. And I think what I find most interesting about the idea of drawing is something about the process of doing it. And I think, I'm inspired by his attitude and approach to drawing. The essay by Frédéric Miguerou in the book, I found it was such a contrast with the essay that his daughter Chloe wrote, in that Miguerou was using this very violent language about incision and cutting and ripping and things jutting out, and there was this kind of physicality and active quality to it. And on the other hand, the image that comes through in Chloe's text is this very quiet person kind of sitting in his room and at his home and spending hours and hours almost compulsively drawing. And this level of focus that I think, for me personally, that is the real legacy, is the kind of privilege of being able to sit and focus and actually work through your ideas slowly and deliberately, using your hands in that way. So for me, I find that process to be very inspiring. And what he's produced is obviously, incredible. So,
I think, go ahead.
I was going to pose another question back of the importance, you were asking about the importance of the drawing, and I think there was something about the where the direction that modernism is going, especially as it was being interpreted in America, of this machine, ultimate efficiency, order, and just the drawing seemed like the only way out to be able to have the sense of the hand, to be able to, as the viewer, see the hand, the humanity, the human part of it.
Since both of you touched on that, the other thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is very powerful, and the redundancy, where I was interested in the idea of the power of drawing, because the other thing which I find incredibly interesting in the work that we have in the library and the work in the book, it was that, of course, the power of drawing always has been present in architecture, and this is common language for pretty much anybody who has been in the practice of it. But in his case, is one of the powerful one in which also the autonomy of the abstraction of it almost take a life of its own, which I think again in the avant-garde that you were talking about, that was also a slightly different and unique in terms of, because in a way he's using fairly established methodologies within different fields, but the recombination and what it produces as an architecture effect is incredibly different. So I want to open a little bit this idea, the power of the drawing as almost as independent life from, let's say, the build work of the architecture drawing itself. So again, these are not really questions; they're more like provocations to talk about how you relate to that, how you see that in his own work on the context of a larger context in that particular period of time.
Drawing as an act is one thing, and I mean, kind of talking about the obsessiveness and the dedication and so forth. And I knew, Lebbeus the same way, who would just sit there for hours and hours. And if you've ever been to Pleshnik's house in Ljubljana, He slept on a bed made of wood, so he wouldn't sleep very much, so he could wake up and just sit there. He was a bachelor, and he sat there and he drew his, I remember kind of looking at that, being horrified on the one hand and going, well, I love drawing, but, what does it mean to get into a kind of penal act of it? And so there's a mythology, I think, is part of the legacy, but that's a different personality than I think Claude Parent's personality. In which case, let me just get back to say that anybody can be obsessed with drawing, but you've got to have a politics and an agenda of what you're working on right at the same time. Everybody's got an idea about the role of drawing or the mythology of it, on the one hand. As you said, it's a conventional, way of working. It's not necessarily been outmoded, even though we don't see much of it, done by hand, presented, as finished work. But I think that Claude Parent's project, when I see the magic marker drawings, and I think of John Haydock drawing in magic marker at a certain point before he drew in, 6H. Pencil, and so the tools start to fit the expressionistic project or the cultural project. I mean, it's no different than anything else, and I think that his sketches are just really, delivering in such an incredible way the agenda of the work. I mean, that's what I see through to that, beyond even, I think, the love of doing it and the act of doing it. Those are things that we talk about, the act and the love of making the drawing, but what's the subject matter? What narrative, what story are we telling here with the,
I think you were speaking to the shift when the drawings were as important as the built work, that we would actually call both a complete architecture. And that seems to be the shift with Haydock and Parent in particular, and now that's fine. Everyone, that's whether you do a drawing and it's acceptable. But I think that was the shift, where it's not just a drawing to be built, but a drawing that was never meant to be built.
Well, it's really interesting that in the architectural work, this idea of the oblique and sort of challenging the body to be present at all times, that's a truly kind of physical experience that was so central to the architectural project. And it's, in a way, it's completely absent, or it's present in a very different way in the drawings. And, I think drawings, they have a certain kind of power. They appeal to one aspect of the intellect. It's obviously a visual medium. But he was also clearly very interested in all the other senses and how one actually experiences and dwells in a space repeatedly, the kinds of habits that you would form living in an oblique house. We can talk to Chloe about that. But yeah, I think there's a definite difference here between the power of the drawing and the power of drawing, and I think both are very interesting in his work. I love the anecdote about when he was drawing in his home, the only time that his children could come and speak to him is when he was hatching, because it didn't take that much concentration. So, yeah.
That brings so many bad memories. And I think you guys were mentioning in one way or another, which I think maybe in many ways, I would argue, look at the hair. That's my tribute. I was planning to cut it, but I thought it would be good to hang it until tomorrow. And I think slowly, to me, at least we're bringing to what I would consider the central part, which is the idea that these multiple parallel languages, they are common ground. It built this notion where I would say, I cannot say he was maybe the first one or anything like that, but he took the idea of a speculation as practice or practice as a speculation to a whole other level in a different way, let's say, that some of the masters from the modernism were approaching it. And to me, there is something incredibly remarkable about that, because in those particular times, again, we're still talking about in a period in which Europe still was trying to reconfigure itself after the Second World War and all that. I mean, we take those things for granted, but when you look in the timeline, these were still incredibly complex and strange periods. And the notion that, and of course, the May 68 and all that was a factor and created other venues for this. But this was a territory in which this notion of speculation as a practice or practice as a speculation was not really at the center of any conversation. And I think, also, Neil, you mentioned Paul Virilli, but also André Bloch was another key figure in this, which, according to Frédéric Miguerou, was one of the first sculptural artists to really use mathematical algorithm to start to interpolate with art. So there were all these Virilio, Parent, Bloch, creating these strange conversations in a way, which right now we take it for granted. But at that time, there was a really groundbreaking trajectory, which maybe at first glance the work will not be so evident. That's the other part where I will talk. That's what I'm talking about. Speculation probably is a better word than radical, because in a way it has a certain anchoring in a familiarity of it, but at the same time it has something very disturbing that is under the surface. So I would like to put that as part of the conversation in terms of the idea of a speculative practice and practical speculation, because this is somebody who also built a substantial amount of building. It was not just the speculation or the drawing as an exercise of escape of realities. These were agencies, again, and Virilio and Bloch as well. These were people who were trying to change reality, and one could argue that everything that we talk today about parallel reality or augmented reality and so on, these were the true pioneers of the creation of this parallel reality that can start to coexist. Again, these are not questions, these are much more non-linear, incoherent thought to fuel. And in a way, I think everybody in this has been affected with this idea of speculation and practice as a way. And I think there were like major accelerators of that possibility.
I think there's a word, and maybe this is what you're tapping into, that is used in the exhibition, subversive. And maybe that's even stronger. It's somewhere between radical and speculative. But what was he trying to subvert? And there was, I think, what I understand from the book that Chloe put together so beautifully in chronological order of what the concerns were through the decade. And the subversive part of it, to me, is a kind of reclaiming of architecture, because it seemed like it was going to go in the direction of kind of developer's folly, the most efficient. And what I was seeing, and Hajduk and a lot of the architects at the time, of how can we reclaim architecture. And this is, I think, something that even this school comes out of that moment of we have to constantly be pushing against, I don't know, a kind of normative approach to, I don't know, the most efficient, the most, most valuable architecture in terms of a developer's lens on it. Reclaim it as an art, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really wondering what it means and what it would be like. Some of the drawings in the book do have this incredible kind of overt ordering system obsession. One of these sort of mesh type, I don't know if it's up here, but a kind of variable web that he had created. And then there's some other kind of interlocking surface systems that he just illustrates in this sort of field condition. And to do that work, we're so accustomed to seeing it done as an algorithmic exercise. So to really be sort of coding in each step of the process, and in a way, there's almost less at stake and less, less risk involved. Whereas to sit down and create a drawing like that, I just wonder, clearly there's a desire to study not just the system, but the affect and the actual sort of ambiance of what the object creates or what the system or the web creates. And, that it's hard to imagine even how one conceives of something like that. So the drawing maybe is an attempt to establish and create a new kind of ordering system, obviously anti-Cartesian in every way possible, and to sort of imagine, how one occupies it or how it occupies the landscape. So.
There was a quote that I liked, architecture is the battle and drawing is serenity. So it felt like there was an exterior and an interior conversation.
Tell us other people.
I think that the context of post-war Europe, leading, up to May '68, the more or less the 15 to 20 year time frame. That's an interesting generational time frame where when just talking about the radical, and when the radical project or the anarchic project in France, the Situationist project or something like that, moves in, but that's actually after, let's say, the theory of the oblique, which on the one hand, as it speculates and cancels out, forms of visual and political organization for a third condition, it did feel like, especially with Virilio involved, it felt like a transitional project, which was, how do we overcome the structures of modernism, and before it becomes, just totally a non-design political project where, drawing then turns into, an art project at some particular level. And that for me is an interesting kind of time frame, which is why I was talking about the kind of speculative architect, the avant-garde architect as a gentleman versus the shift to youth culture, on the one hand, where, persona and everything had to, completely shift in a way. So the drawings, and I'm thinking of, say, Wolf drawing with the eyes closed as I'm going to make a drawing, but I'm going to not make a drawing at the same time. I'm not going to control anything, et cetera. Political kind of cultural agenda where, you look at this work and it's hatched and shaded, and the chiaroscuro of the work and the Beaux-Arts is still sort of present in a way. I just want to say we're all a product of our time, and we're all a product of our context, and that was slightly different than Habermasian world in Germany, for instance. That was different in France with Foucault, for instance. And while I don't think we ever read Claude Parent as an architect who was writing theoretical texts that weren't also, as you said, they weren't detached. They were completely, connected to whether it's plausibility or whether it's viability or whether it's the attraction to, how to communicate with the public. I mean, that sense was always there. I think that's what you're saying, and I agree with that.
The two things that are a little bit more one-liner or simpler before I would like to open to the audience to express or to have questions or whatever else that you can imagine. There are two things that I find one fascinating. One is that, which is, you mentioned Michel Foucault, and when he edited the normal and the pathological. One period I found fascinating was once he was working on the nuclear plants, and what was the architecture and the design dimension of that as something that it was born after fear of destruction, and then it has to move into a different territory. And again, the subversion of that. I mean, the idea how architecture can claim or reclaim territories. So that was a particular interesting, unique moment too, which also is something that it has happened in other contexts, but also that was very much byproduct of the context of the 50s and the 60s, and that cloud, and the idea that you would embrace that as somebody who is a designer and thinking and leading a group of people to rethink that. There was something incredibly interesting about that notion too, almost that nothing is out of limits and nothing that cannot be filtered into something that can become something to speculative design. And the other one, which again, and these are again things to provoke you guys some kind of reaction. The other thing I always find, and this is borderline banal, but there is something really interesting about it for another interesting speculative architect, Enric Mirages, who also had these conversations about how you dress. I always found fascinating that he was impeccable in terms of his posture, will not be the posture of the work that was produced. There was an interesting also dichotomy too in terms of what was the social presence of what you operate and the work that you were doing. And I always found there is something incredibly, I'm saying this in a positive way, but there was something incredibly disturbing of that period of time in which people operate under the canon of social behavior on the surface in a conventional way, producing this incredibly subversive work behind. So these two things, which I will say at first glance, the nuclear plants or dressing with suits and on bow ties or whatever, but there is something about that strangeness too, about the getting to the territory or normalcy or new forms of normalcies and reclaim them to produce a whole other things underneath. Whatever that means, but there is something very peculiar about that in this time and age is kind of unthinkable.
Yeah, I
mean, this is something I think you will feel intrigued by, Neil.
Yeah, no, let's say when he came to SCI-Arc in the late 90s.
There is a beautiful video of you in the show.
Oh, okay.
You look the same.
And his interest in the school was such that it was like, look, all the new ideas are happening here, and that's what my search is. He's the last person to sort of walk around and go, I'm an eminence grise, and let me tell you how the world works. I think he came here with such openness and curiosity. And then I think that was part of the generosity, but really it was curiosity. And it always makes me think that, really, while we play generational politics and there's generational limits and so forth, for me it's always been the way he thought, which was indifference to generations. And, it's all about where's an idea, who can I talk to, about that work. And that's what I felt when he came here, that it was, he would sit down and, look at a student's project and see an evolved thing there, as opposed to treating it as though, you had to have 30 years in the field or something to, like a new idea could come from anywhere. I mean, that to me is the most open-ended sort of speculative mindset, at some level. But just to talk about him as a curious soul, till the end. Not many even in that generation were like that, because I got to meet a number of them, and both here and other places, some still alive, some. And there was a curious sense of, well, they'd say, I'm a modern architect. That's really what I am, nothing more, nothing less, kind of carrying a card in a way. And I always felt the difference between a person like that versus, let's say, John Johansson, who was a contemporary and never talked about, let's say, the limits of, the stylistic thing, or I was born into it, or there's a way in which you protect your ideas. I think coming here, I saw him, Claude Parent, just feel like vulnerable and open to anything, just genuine, amazing.
That's sort of an aspect that I take away from his work, in difference maybe to like a Lebbeus Woods, which I feel is very political and very much about ideologies. And for me, what comes across is a kind of respect and empathy for humanity and humans, and the oblique is to feel again and to experience again and have, kind of introduce conversations, but also the environmental work to be in fissures and think about your role on Earth, and then the migration series that we were talking about earlier, and this empathy for man, the anonymous human, I think really comes across both in the drawings and in the writings, and I didn't get to hear him speak, but sounds like comes across in person too.
Yeah, I mean, that work in particular is very interesting, and it really, I think, drives the point home that so much of his drawing was really just an illustration of a different way of living, any kind of new sort of social situation that he could imagine or hope for or sort of conjecture. The drawing was this kind of struggle to somehow illustrate what that life would be like. And I understood that he was, very presciently starting to feel a lot of concern about these mass migrations a little bit before the crises that are now plaguing Europe. And so this project to somehow provide order to the experience, I thought was very interesting, and to embrace this flow in a sense. It's not clear to me in the work whether there's a sense that the migration is voluntary or involuntary, but in any case, there is this idea that you can be in a kind of a state of constant movement, and the environment can facilitate that, and that there's a positivity to this movement and this adaptation that occurs as you go through, along this pathway. So.